In 2001, Sophie, the new Countess of Wessex, was a royal disgrace. A tabloid fake Sheikh had just tricked her into insulting the monarchy on tape, shattering her PR career. Mere months later, she collapsed, being airlifted to a hospital, bleeding to death from a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. She had lost her career, her first child, and almost her life. She was a failed experiment, the outsider, who proved she couldn't handle the pressure. Yet 20 years later, that same woman stood on the Buckingham Palace balcony, a trusted, inner circle member of King Charles's new slimmed-down monarchy. This is the story of the other royal bride of the 90s, the one who wasn't Diana and wasn't Fergie. It is a 30-year masterclass in survival, a quiet story of how a normal woman endured public humiliation and devastating private loss to become Queen Elizabeth's second daughter and the secret weapon holding the family together. The crucial difference between Sophie's success and the spectacular failures of others is where she came from. And she came from nowhere. When Lady Diana Spencer got engaged to Prince Charles, she was the daughter of an earl, raised on a 13,000-acre estate, a childhood playmate of the prince's. She was part of the circle. When Sarah Ferguson married Prince Andrew, she was the daughter of the Queen's Royal Cavalry Major, a part of the horsey, aristocratic country set. In 1999, when Sophie Rhys-Jones married Prince Edward, the press tried to find a connection. They searched desperately. The best they could come up with? She was a distant descendant of a Norman king. It was a stretch because the truth was far simpler. Sophie was completely and unapologetically middle class. She was born in 1965 as Sophie Helen Rhys-Jones. Her father, Christopher, was not an earl or a major. He was a sales director for a tire company. Her mother, Mary, was a secretary. She grew up not at Althorpe Palace, but on a modest farmhouse in Brenchley, Kent. She was a typical Kentish girl who went to a state school, pulled pints in a pub on the weekends, and, like millions of other young women in the 1980s, trained as a secretary. This is the first and most crucial difference. While Diana and Fergie entered the firm when they were barely out of their teens with almost no real-world experience, Sophie, by contrast, had a career, a real decade-long career. She was not a naive girl waiting for a prince. She was a rising public relations professional. She started at Capital Radio in London, but she wasn't content to be just a Londoner. She was adventurous. She moved to Switzerland, taking a job as a ski rep in the glamorous resort of Crans, Montana, a role that required logistical skill and relentless social savvy. After that, she took a year off and backpacked alone across Australia, sleeping in hostels. In short, she was a modern, independent, self-made woman. She had seen the world. She had paid her own bills. She had a life before royalty. And in 1993, at the age of 28, she was back in London, working on a promotional event for a charity tennis tournament. One of the event's organizers was Prince Edward, the Queen's youngest son. Now we need to talk about Edward. Edward was always the forgotten one. He wasn't the heir, the naval hero, or the gruff, relentlessly hard-working one. He was the artistic one. He was the one who had famously quit the Royal Marines after just a few months of training, a minor embarrassment for the family, to follow his passion, the theater. He had worked for Andrew Lloyd Webber's theater company and was trying to start his own television production company. He, like Sophie, was attempting to be a working person in the real world. They met. And unlike his brother's disastrous whirlwind romances, their relationship was slow. They dated, and they kept dating for 6 years. In those 6 years, the world around them imploded. This is the context in which their relationship was formed, the dark period of the House of Windsor. They started dating in 1993. What was 1993? It was the year of Camillagate, when the tapes of Charles's and Camilla's intimate phone calls were leaked. It was just after Diana's Squidgy Gate, just after Sarah Ferguson's toe-sucking scandal, and just after the 1992 Annus Horribilis, when Windsor Castle burned and the War of the Waleses had become all-out public warfare. The entire institution was collapsing in disgrace, and in the middle of all this were Edward and Sophie, the boring couple. The press, high on a diet of A-list scandals, hardly knew what to do with them. They didn't scream, they didn't cheat, they didn't leak to the press, they just went to the cinema. They had dinner. But the press suspicion was high. They had been burned before. They were promised a fairy tale with Diana and got a war. They were promised a breath of fresh air with Fergie and got a scandal. Now they looked at Sophie and tried to jam her into the same mold. She was called the new Diana, scrutinized for her blonde hair and figure, but the mold didn't fit. So they tried another angle, starting to call her Weighty Sophie, a predecessor to Weighty Katie. 6 years was an unusually long time to date a prince, and the press narrative was that she was being cruelly tested by the palace. The truth was, they were just getting to know each other, and perhaps intelligently, Sophie looked at the chaos around her and decided the safest thing to do was nothing, to make no noise. In 1997, the tragedy struck. Diana died. Diana's death changed everything. It changed the press, it changed the royal family, and it changed the rules for Sophie. The appetite for a new icon had died with Diana. Now what the royal family and the public craved more than anything was stability, normalcy, even boredom. And Sophie Rhys-Jones, the boring Chuck, stable, independent PR girl, was suddenly the perfect asset. In 1999, 6 years after they met, Edward proposed. Their wedding was a statement, not a massive global state event at St. Paul's Cathedral, but a family affair at the relatively modest St. George's Chapel, Windsor. And their titles were a statement. This is a key detail. By tradition, a son of the Queen is made a duke upon marriage. Prince Andrew became the Duke of York, but Edward and Sophie requested something different. They were made the Earl and Countess of Wessex, a much lower-ranking title. The story given was that Edward loved the film Shakespeare in Love, which had a character named the Earl of Wessex. It was a whimsical story, but it hid a deeper truth. They were trying to lower the stakes. They didn't want to be full-time senior royals. And this is where their biggest, most catastrophic mistake was made. Buckingham Palace announced that Edward and Sophie would continue their professional careers. They would try to do both. They would be part-time royals, half the time cutting ribbons, the other half running their own private companies. A royal countess running a for-profit PR firm? That was a blatant conflict of interest, a ticking time bomb. The press, of course, did not wait for the part-time royal experiment to fail. They attacked before the wedding. Just weeks before she was set to marry into the family in 1999, a tabloid reporter from The Sun dug up an old photo of Sophie. It was from her normal life years earlier, on a holiday, topless, with a radio DJ colleague. The Sun ran it, full page. It was a brutal, deliberate humiliation, a welcome to the family hazing. The palace was furious. The Queen, in a rare public gesture of support, was reportedly incandescent on Sophie's behalf. But the message to Sophie was clear. You are a target. The press had found their new Fergie. This is the crucial psychological context. When Sophie started her PR firm after this, she wasn't just arrogant, she was defensive. She had survived one attack. She believed she could manage the press, that she was smarter than them. She had forgotten the most important rule. She wasn't playing the game anymore. She was the game. For 2 years, from 1999 to 2001, she tried to walk that impossible tightrope. It was a life of surreal contradiction. On a Tuesday morning, she would be Her Royal Highness, cutting a ribbon at a children's hospice. By the afternoon, she would be Sophie Rhys-Jones, CEO of RJH Public Relations, trying to win a contract from a luxury car brand. The conflict was an ethical minefield. What were clients really buying? Her PR skills or her royal letterhead? The tabloids, still cynical, and in a post-Diana, post-Fergie feeding frenzy, knew exactly what they thought. They found their box for her, the capitalist, the greedy one. They called her Sophie Cash Jones. Journalists with barely concealed glee began to connect the dots. How, they asked, had her small firm suddenly landed lucrative contracts from companies like the Rover Car Group? They painted a picture of a woman ruthlessly cashing in. And that arrogance, the belief that she could still operate as a civilian insider, led her straight into the most infamous trap in British journalism. In April 2001, the second and fatal bomb detonated. The villain of this story is a man named Majher Mahmood, the fake Sheikh for Rupert Murdoch's News of the World. He posed as a fabulously wealthy Arab tycoon, promising a multi-million-pound deal to Sophie's firm. For Sophie, this was the ultimate prize. It would prove her firm was a legitimate global player, that her success was her own, not her husband's. She was baited by her own professional pride. She walked right into it. The meeting was set at the Dorchester Hotel, and Sophie, in her element, pitching the client, did what she had done 1,000 times before. She tried to build rapport. She tried to show him she was a true insider. She gossiped. She was indiscreet. And the entire devastating conversation was being secretly recorded. When the News of the World contacted the palace, it was a checkmate. They had her. Sophie, the PR exec, tried one last, desperate PR move. Before the tapes could be released, she gave a fawning, damage control interview to another newspaper, talking about how wonderful the Queen was. It was a transparent, frantic attempt to spin the story before it broke. It was useless. The fake Sheikh tapes were released. The damage control interview, published at the same time, only made her look more manipulative and two-faced. The content of the tapes was an absolute catastrophe. The tabloids screamed. They alleged first that she had brazenly used her royal status. But far worse for the palace, she had been caught breaking the cardinal, sacred rules of the family. She had talked. The tapes allegedly captured her calling the Queen the old dear. In private, an affectionate term. Printed in a tabloid, it sounded disrespectful. She allegedly called the government of Tony Blair a mess, a violation of royal neutrality. But the kill shot, the comment that sent shockwaves through the family, was about Camilla Parker Bowles. At this time, Prince Charles was in the middle of a painstaking PR campaign to rehabilitate Camilla's image. The tapes allegedly caught Sophie, his sister-in-law, questioning whether the public would ever accept Camilla as queen. This wasn't just gossip. In the eyes of the palace, this was treason. It was a direct hit on the future king. Sophie, the PR professional, had been publicly executed by her own profession. She had been beaten decisively at her own game. The humiliation was total. Like Diana and Fergie before her, she had committed the unpardonable sin. In an instant, her career, her independence, and her reputation were gone. Her PR career was over instantly. The fallout from the fake Sheikh scandal was absolute. Sophie, the PR professional, had become the one thing her profession cannot tolerate: bad press. Her company, RJH, was now toxic. Clients fled overnight. A reputation built over a decade was shattered in a single weekend. But the professional humiliation was nothing compared to the institutional one. She was summoned to Windsor to face the Queen. We will never know what was said in that room, but the result was a public execution. The palace issued a cold, clear statement. The great experiment of the part-time working royals was a catastrophic failure. Both Sophie and Edward would be stepping down from their private careers, effective immediately. This wasn't a choice. It was an unconditional surrender. Sophie, the self-made woman who had cherished her independence, was now in her mid-30s, forced to give it all up. She had lost her career, her independence, and her normal identity all in one go. She was now entirely dependent on the firm, funded by the sovereign grant, living in a grace and favor house, her life no longer her own. She was, in the eyes of the world, a kept woman, a failed businesswoman. For the press, this was the end of the story. She had been arrogant, she had been caught, and she had been punished. And so for the next 8 months, Sophie Rhys-Jones disappeared. She was in a state of royal limbo, a public disgrace, trapped in her home at Bagshot Park. She was pregnant with her first child, but even that joy was overshadowed by the public shame. She was waiting for the story to die down, waiting to just fade into the background as boring Sophie. And that would have been the end of the story. But 2001 was not finished with Sophie Rhys-Jones. The public humiliation was just the prelude. The real crucible, the one that would change everything, was still to come. In December, while at home at Bagshot Park, Sophie collapsed in agonizing pain. This was not a simple, sad miscarriage. It was a catastrophic medical emergency. She was bleeding internally from a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy is when a fertilized egg implants outside the womb, often in the fallopian tube. It is not a viable pregnancy. It is, in short, a ticking time bomb, and it had just detonated. Sophie was, quite literally, bleeding to death from the inside. She was airlifted by helicopter to the King Edward VII Hospital in London and rushed into emergency life-saving surgery. She had lost a terrifying amount of blood. Doctors later confirmed she had been just minutes from death, and the same press corps that had been gleefully tearing her apart just months before was now camped outside that same hospital, holding a grim vigil, waiting for news of her survival. The most powerful image of this entire period was not of Sophie, it was of her husband. Prince Edward, the artistic, forgotten son, often perceived as aloof, emerged from the hospital, and he was visibly broken. This was not a prince. This was a terrified man who had just almost lost his wife. His face was gray, he was visibly trembling, and he said, his voice cracking, "It's a very traumatic time. It's just the most tragic thing that can happen, but she's very plucky." In that one unguarded, deeply human moment, the entire narrative changed. The weighty Sophie and Sophie Cash-Jones labels evaporated. The press and the public suddenly saw what had been there all along, not a scandal, but a couple, a real, normal couple, going through an unimaginable private hell right in front of the world. This tragedy, in a dark and terrible way, was Sophie's salvation. Most immediately, it forced the press to back off. The British press, now living in the post-Diana world, was terrified of being blamed for hounding another woman they had just spent a year painting as a greedy social climber. Now, she was a woman who had lost her first child and nearly died. To attack her would have been monstrous. So they gave her something they had never given Diana or Fergie: space. But far more importantly, this crucible changed Sophie. Think about her psychological state at the end of 2001. She is 36 years old. She has been publicly humiliated, forced to give up the career and independence she cherished. She has just lost her first desperately wanted child, and she has come within a razor's edge of losing her own life. She had been stripped of everything. This is the moment of her rebirth. This is the fire that forged the Duchess we know today. She had hit rock bottom, and in that she found a strange, terrible kind of freedom. She no longer had to try to be a PR girl or a modern working woman. She no longer had to worry about what the press thought of her. She had survived the worst of the press, and she had survived the worst of personal tragedy. All that was left was the one job she hadn't chosen, the one she had been forced into, the job of being a full-time working royal. Her old life was gone. The only way forward was to build a new one from the ashes. And so, Sophie Rhys-Jones, the survivor, made a conscious decision. She would no longer try to be glamorous like Diana or fun like Fergie. She would no longer try to manage the press. Instead, she would do the one thing no one else was doing: put her head down, be quiet, be loyal, and just work. She was about to begin the slowest, most unglamorous, and most successful royal rebranding in modern history. She was going to embrace the one word she had always feared. She was going to become boring. From then on, she chose predictability over publicity. But boring in royal terms is a code word for survival. It means you stop making it about you and start making it about the work. This was the beginning of the great, quiet 20-year rebranding of Sophie Wessex. She and Edward stepped away from the wreckage of their commercial lives and began the slow, unglamorous climb back. They didn't chase the high-profile celebrity causes that had defined Diana, AIDS and landmines, or even Charles, with the environment. Sophie's new strategy was to go in the opposite direction. She went for the gritty, the difficult, the unglamorous. She became the patron of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, dealing with the harsh realities of child abuse. She championed agricultural shows, earning the trust of the rural, get-on-with-it communities. She began working tirelessly for organizations supporting people with disabilities and blindness. There were no Vogue covers, no celebrity lunches at San Lorenzo. Her work now consisted of hospital wings, community centers, and muddy military bases. She wasn't just rebuilding her identity. She was deliberately adopting the stoic, uncomplaining model of the two royals who had weathered every storm: her father-in-law, Prince Philip, and her sister-in-law, Princess Anne. The new strategy was simple, and it was bulletproof. Head down, mouth shut, show up. But that 20-year rebirth was not a perfect straight line. Even in her new, boring life of hard work, a ghost from her past returned to test her. The year was 2011. Edward and Sophie made an official visit to Bahrain. The problem was this visit took place right in the middle of the Arab Spring, and the Bahraini regime was being heavily criticized for its crackdown on pro-democracy protesters. And then the news leaked. Edward and Sophie had accepted gifts of jewelry from the Bahraini royal family. The press pounced. For them, this was the proof they needed. Sophie Cash-Jones's was back. They accused the couple of naivety and political deafness, once again blurring the line between royal duty and personal gain. The old familiar whispers had returned. But here is the crucial part and the proof of her transformation. The Sophie of 2011 was completely different from the Sophie of 2001. The 2001 PR girl had panicked. She had tried to manage the story. She gave interviews, tried to spin the narrative, and ultimately set herself on fire. The 2011 Countess, the veteran, followed the Queen's playbook. She said nothing. She offered no explanation. She didn't complain. She had learned the most valuable lesson: never get into a fight with the press. she remained silent. She endured the storm of criticism, and she kept on working. And because she didn't react, the story had no oxygen to burn. It died. She had passed the test. She had proven she'd learned to survive not by fighting back, but by outlasting. She was rebuilding a professional identity as a patron, but her personal journey was about to be hit by yet another crucible, one that would test her physical and mental limits. In 2003, 2 years after the ectopic pregnancy, Sophie was pregnant again. The couple was cautiously overjoyed, but the trauma of 2001 lingered. This, too, would be a trial by fire. In November 2003, 1 month before her due date, Prince Edward was on an official visit to Mauritius, on the other side of the world. Sophie was at home at Bagshot Park when she again collapsed. She was in agonizing, sudden pain, bleeding profusely. It was another catastrophic life-or-death emergency, a placental abruption. The placenta had torn away from the uterine wall, a condition that was killing both her and the baby. She was rushed once again to Frimley Park Hospital. An emergency team was assembled for an immediate C-section. She was utterly alone, her husband thousands of miles away, scrambling for a flight. Their daughter, Lady Louise, was born, weighing just 4 pounds 9 ounces. She was premature, sick, and immediately transferred to a separate neonatal intensive care unit in London. Sophie, having lost over 9 pints of blood, was left fighting for her own life, miles away from her newborn child. This is a level of trauma almost unimaginable. To survive the 2001 tragedy only to face death again, this time isolated from your husband and separated from your critically ill child. This shared near miss, this double trauma, forged an incredibly powerful bond not just between Sophie and Edward, but with the Queen, who reportedly watched in profound admiration at her new daughter-in-law's resilience. It solidified Sophie's new reality. Her life was not glamorous, it was fragile, and it was real. When they finally brought Louise home, the cause that had been a patronage became a mission. Their daughter had esotropia, a severe eye condition. This cemented Sophie's life path. Her work for the visually impaired wasn't a royal cause chosen from a list. It was now her life. In 2007, she gave birth again, this time thankfully without incident, to their son, James. The family was complete. And with James's birth, the Queen made a quiet but hugely significant gesture, signaling the complete acceptance of Sophie and her family. Their son was given the title Viscount Severn. On the surface, just another royal title. But the name was the key. Severn was not a random royal location. The River Severn flows through Wales, and the name was chosen as a direct, deliberate homage to Sophie's Welsh family roots. Think about this. This was a profoundly personal and rare gesture. The Queen was sending a clear message. The Rhys-Jones family, the family of the tire salesman and the secretary from Kent, was now part of the British royal story. Their heritage, her heritage, was being honored in an official royal title. This wasn't just a title for James. It was a gift for Sophie. It was the final sign that her rebirth was complete. She was no longer the outsider who had been fired. She was a core part of the family, so much so that her own bloodline was now woven into the monarchy's legacy. The family was complete, and for the next decade, the Wessexes successfully executed their new strategy. They became the normal ones. They were the family living down the road, raising their children, and quietly racking up over 500 royal engagements a year. The press, in turn, left them alone. They were boring, and as all the media oxygen was being sucked up by the new high-drama stories of William, Kate, Harry, and Meghan, being boring was the greatest gift they could have received. But while the public's gaze was elsewhere, the most important gaze in the world was on her. Under the radar, the most significant relationship of Sophie's life was blossoming. She was becoming the Queen's rock. The fake Sheikh scandal was long forgiven. Why? Because Sophie had earned her way back with 2 decades of flawless, silent work. She also had the unique advantage of proximity. Bagshot Park is just 11 miles from Windsor Castle, so Sophie could pop round for tea informally with no agenda. She became, as royal insiders have stated again and again, the Queen's second daughter. She was the one the Queen could be normal with. They didn't have to talk about the business of the monarchy. They could sit in their headscarves, watch the horse racing, and pore over military history documents in the royal archives. In short, Sophie was the anti-Diana. She was not a competitor, not a threat, and not trying to outshine the Queen. She was simply a comfort. As she built this personal trust, she was also building an entirely new professional portfolio. The boring work on blindness and disability was just the beginning. As her confidence and status within the firm grew, so did the gravity of her work. This was no longer just ribbon cutting. She became a global champion for the Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict initiative. This is not glamorous charity work. This is tough diplomatic work. It's sitting in refugee camps, listening to the stories no one wants to hear, confronting the brutality of war. When the family began to fracture again, Sophie's values skyrocketed. Prince Andrew, the Queen's favorite son, was imploding in the Epstein scandal. Prince Harry, her beloved grandson, was waging a public war against the family. It was chaos. It was the 1990s all over again. Betrayal, scandal, and screaming headlines. And through it all, there was Sophie, quiet, loyal, showing up, never complaining. She had learned the only lesson that matters for survival. And then in 2021, the first great pillar of the monarchy fell. Prince Philip died, and in that moment, the world finally saw the unique position Sophie held. In the first public appearance after his death, it wasn't Charles or William who spoke to the press. It was Edward, and a visibly grieving Sophie. She was the one who gave the world that single, intimate, heartbreaking quote. It was just like someone took him by the hand and off he went. It was very, very peaceful. And that's all you want for somebody, isn't it? This wasn't a press release. It was the intimate report of a daughter-in-law who had been in the room during his final days. The one who, it was reported, was the Queen's greatest comfort. At the funeral, while the world's cameras focused on the Queen sitting alone in the drama of William and Harry, Sophie was simply there, supporting her family. In the weeks that followed, as the Queen grieved in her Windsor bubble, it was Sophie who reportedly had a rota, visiting her every single day, just to sit, just to be there. The transformation was complete. The PR girl who was publicly fired by the firm in 2001 had, by 2021, become its most indispensable, trusted, and loyal pillar. She had lost the battle for her old life, but in the most quiet and profound way, she had won the entire war. For the next year and a half, the world watched a queen in twilight. This was the long, slow goodbye. And in those final, frail public appearances, Sophie was almost always with her. This was no longer about royal duty. This was about human devotion. She wasn't just near the Queen. She was the one. She was the one photographed sharing a blanket in the car, the one chosen to ride with her to church at Sandringham. She was the one whose presence could still, in those final difficult months, make the Queen's face light up with a genuine, unguarded smile. While Prince Charles was burdened with the transition of power and the state boxes, and while Princess Anne was, as ever, stoically fulfilling her own duties, Sophie was the one who could just be there. She understood the precious gift of normal female companionship. She would, as reports say, simply drive over from Bagshot Park to Windsor Castle, not as a countess, but as a daughter, to walk the dogs, to watch the racing, to sit in companionable silence. She had done the impossible. She had transcended the role of daughter-in-law and become, in the simplest human terms, her mother-in-law's best friend. And then in September 2022, the second and final pillar of the Elizabethan age fell. The Queen died at Balmoral. For the nation, it was a moment of profound historical grief. For the family, it was the loss of their matriarch. But for Sophie, it was the loss of the woman who had become her mentor, her champion, and, by all accounts, her second mother. She, along with Edward, was one of the royals who raced to Balmoral, arriving in that frantic, terrible afternoon, just in time to be there as the monarchy held its breath. In the 10 days of national mourning that followed, that long, public, emotional marathon, the world finally saw Sophie's new role in plain view. By protocol, she was not the most important woman there. The heavy, formal burden of grief fell to the new Queen Consort, Camilla, and the new Princess of Wales, Catherine. They were the future. They were the ones being scrutinized. But Sophie emerged, in many ways, as the emotional center of the family. She was the stable, quiet bridge between the old guard and the new, between the public's grief and the family's private sorrow. And it was her own grief that seemed the most authentic. While others, through duty, maintained a stoic reserve, Sophie's face was a map of real, human sorrow. She wasn't performing. When she was photographed wiping a tear from her eye at the vigil, or taking a deep, shuddering breath, the public didn't see a countess. They saw a daughter who had just lost her mother. But she wasn't just grieving, she was working. She was acting as the family's emotional ballast. We saw it in that unguarded moment when she, the 20-year veteran, put a comforting, protective arm around the new Princess of Wales. Catherine was under unbelievable pressure, the new focus of the world's cameras. And in that gesture, Sophie was no longer an outsider. She was the mentor, the steady hand supporting the future queen. And then, in a moment of extraordinary diplomacy, we saw her with Meghan Markle. As the family fractures were on full display, as the press watched for any sign of a snub, Sophie, the former PR executive who was once destroyed by the press, performed a masterstroke of royal public relations. She saw Meghan, standing isolated, and she gently, publicly, engaged her in conversation, sharing a car, acting as the bridge. It was a subtle, powerful act of public unity, a gesture of duty that rose above the personal drama. The fake Sheikh scandal had come full circle. She was now using her PR skills for the crown, not for herself. When she stood on that Buckingham Palace balcony, first for the funeral, and then, months later, for King Charles's coronation, the picture was complete. The balcony was sparse. The star power and distracting drama of Harry and Meghan was gone. The toxic disgrace of Andrew had left a void. The stage, for the first time in modern history, was not crowded. And there, at the absolute core of this new, slimmed-down monarchy, standing next to the heirs, was Sophie, the boring PR girl from Kent, the last woman standing. But this is the crucial hidden detail. She was standing there not just because the Queen had loved her. She was standing there because the new king desperately needs her. Because while the world saw her as the Queen's companion, the British government saw her as something else entirely, their most courageous and effective diplomatic asset. While other royals were cutting ribbons at garden parties, Sophie was quietly redefining the purpose of a modern royal. She became the first member of the family to visit South Sudan, bringing global attention to the victims of its brutal civil war. Then, in April 2024, she did the unthinkable. She became the first member of the royal family to go to Ukraine since the Russian invasion began. This was not a safe royal visit. This was a high-risk state-level diplomatic mission into an active war zone. She wasn't there to wave. She was there to work. She met with President Zelensky. She visited sites of torture in Bucha. And, drawing on her own long-standing work, she met with survivors of wartime sexual violence, bringing a level of global attention to the issue that no politician could. Just months later, she was the first royal to visit Chad, meeting refugees fleeing the new civil war in Sudan. This is not fluffy work. This is high-stakes, emotionally devastating state-level diplomacy. This is soft power at its sharpest and most courageous edge. The transformation was absolute. The PR girl who was brought down by a fake sheikh has now become the senior stateswoman trusted to meet with President Zelensky during a full-scale war. It was no surprise then when King Charles, in one of his first and most significant acts, formally bestowed upon his brother Edward the title his father, Prince Philip, had always wished for him. Edward and Sophie were elevated from the Wessexes to become the new Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. This was not just a new title, it was the ultimate reward and a strategic promotion. It was the public acknowledgement that she was no longer just the Countess of Wessex doing local charity work. She was now the Duchess of Edinburgh, a senior stateswoman, a key player in the future of the monarchy's global soft power. She had inherited her father-in-law's title and her mother-in-law's complete, unbreakable trust. So what is her legacy? Why did she survive when the stories of Diana and Fergie were cautionary tales of combustion and expulsion? The answer is the great defining irony of her life. Diana was a star. She tried to outshine the institution. She was a rival son, and the monarchy cannot tolerate two sons. Sarah Ferguson was a rebel. She tried to defy the institution, to cash in on it, to live outside its rules, but Sophie was a professional. She, the PR girl, was the only one who, after a catastrophic failure, understood what the other two never did, that the firm is not a family in the way we know it. It is a corporation. And being a royal is not a fairy tale. It is a job. It's a strange, relentless, lifelong job of public service, where the metrics for success are the opposite of the modern world. Success is not being the loudest voice, it's being the quietest. It's not about building your brand. It's about serving theirs. Sophie in 2001 had tried to be a celebrity. She had failed spectacularly. She had been fired. So, in an act of profound pragmatic intelligence, she learned from her failure. She retrained. She learned that the job was not to be interesting, but to be useful. Not to be glamorous, but to be dependable. She understood that in this strange, gilded cage, the only way to find freedom was to accept the rules. The great irony is that Sophie Rhys-Jones, the woman whose commercial PR career was destroyed in a public scandal, has become the single greatest, most successful public relations asset the House of Windsor has. She is the living, breathing proof of their values. She is the normal one who assimilated. She is the bridge. She is the only senior royal who knows what it's like to pull a pint, to ride the bus, to build a career from nothing, and to lose it. And she is the only one who has also known the unique, isolating pressure of a royal title, the trauma of a public scandal, and the profound personal grief of losing a child. She is the last link between the world we live in and the abstract, alien world they inhabit. Her story is not a fairy tale. It is something far more realistic and far more powerful. It is a story of resilience. It is the story of a woman who was publicly broken, who endured private, unspeakable tragedy, and who chose to rebuild her life, not with glamour or fame, but with the quiet, unshowy, and almost forgotten virtues of duty, loyalty, and simply getting on with the job.